November 23, 1943. The jungle canopy above Bougainville shook with a sound that Captain Takeshi Yamada had never experienced in 2 years of Pacific combat. Not the crack of rifle fire, not the whistle of falling bombs, something deeper. A rolling thunder that seemed to originate from the earth itself and climb through his chest cavity until his teeth rattled and his vision blurred. 6 miles away, the U.S. 3rd Marine Division's artillery regiment was beginning its preparatory barrage. 108 howitzers firing in coordinated volleys that delivered more explosive tonnage in 30 minutes than the entire Imperial Japanese Army possessed in its combined artillery inventory across the Solomon Islands. Yamada crouched in his command bunker, watching dust drift from the log ceiling as the bombardment walked toward his defensive positions with mathematical precision. This was artillery fire as industrial process rather than tactical support, and it would shatter every assumption Japanese doctrine held about ground warfare in the Pacific. The morning of November 20th, 1943 found Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup studying artillery deployment maps in the operations tent of the 3rd Marine Division on Guadalcanal. His 105th mm howitzer battalion represented just one component of the divisional artillery that would support the upcoming Bougainville operation, but the numbers still impressed him, even after months of witnessing American industrial capacity transformed into firepower. 12 battalions of artillery, 72 guns capable of firing shells weighing 95 pounds to ranges exceeding 11,000 yards, supporting a single Marine division conducting operations on an island whose total Japanese garrison numbered fewer than 20,000 troops. Shoup had served with artillery units in peacetime, when a typical division might deploy with 2 or 3 battalions, providing fire support for multiple regiments. The expansion of American artillery capabilities since Pearl Harbor reflected industrial production that treated heavy weapons as expendable resources rather than carefully preserved assets. At 5 feet 11 inches and 172 pounds, Shoup embodied the physical advantages that American forces brought to Pacific combat, but the real disparity lay not in individual soldier capabilities, but in the industrial capacity that produced artillery pieces faster than Japanese factories manufactured rifles. The 3rd Marine Division's table of organization listed equipment allocations that would have seemed impossible to military planners just 2 years earlier. Each artillery battalion operated with 12 howitzers, complete sets of spare parts, forward observers, equipped with radio communications linking them directly to fire direction centers, and ammunition supplies calculated to sustain continuous fire missions for extended periods without resupply concerns. The division's organic transportation included trucks sufficient to move entire battalions between firing positions within hours, while maintenance sections possessed tools and spare parts adequate for field repairs of major components. Captain Yamada commanded the 2nd Battalion of the Imperial Japanese Army's 229th Infantry Regiment, a unit that had fought across China and the Solomon Islands with distinction earned through tactical skill rather than material advantage. His regimental artillery support consisted of 4 Type 94 75mm mountain guns, weapons designed for mobility and simplicity rather than range or explosive power. Each gun weighed just 1,200 pounds, light enough for disassembly and transport by pack animals or infantry crews through terrain where heavier weapons could not operate. The trade-off for this mobility came in reduced capability. The Type 94 fired shells, weighing just under 15 pounds to maximum ranges of 8,000 yards, less than 75% of the range achieved by American 105mm howitzers, while delivering explosive charges that contained 40% less high-explosive filler. Yamada's entire regimental artillery could deliver approximately 240 pounds of explosives per salvo, assuming all 4 guns fired simultaneously and achieved hits on target. A single American artillery battalion, firing a 6-gun battery, produced more explosive effect in one salvo than Yamada's entire regiment could generate in sustained fire missions lasting several minutes. The mathematical disparity extended beyond simple shell weights to encompass every aspect of artillery operations, from ammunition supply to fire control systems. American artillery battalions, deployed with sufficient trucks and trailers to carry thousands of shells directly to firing positions, while Japanese mountain gun crews relied on human porters or pack animals to move ammunition from distant supply dumps to forward positions. A single American howitzer battery could sustain fire rates of 4 rounds per gun per minute for extended periods, expending ammunition at rates that Japanese logistics networks could not have supplied, even if they possessed equivalent numbers of guns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical implications of these disparities became apparent during the first hours of the Bougainville landing. Shoup's artillery battalion established firing positions just inland from the invasion beaches at Cape Torokina, emplacing their howitzers on surveyed positions that forward observers had marked during pre-landing reconnaissance. Within 2 hours of coming ashore, the battalion fired its first fire mission in support of infantry advancing toward Japanese defensive positions at the Paiva River. The forward observer, a first lieutenant named Morrison, called for fire on coordinates where aerial reconnaissance had identified Japanese bunkers. The Fire Direction Center calculated range and deflection data, transmitting firing commands to gun crews who loaded and fired in smooth sequences perfected through months of training. 6 rounds landed within 50 yards of the target coordinates within 3 minutes of Morrison's initial call for fire. The forward observer adjusted fire, walking the impact zone toward the Japanese positions, with corrections transmitted by radio and executed by gun crews, whose practice had reduced the time between adjustments to under 30 seconds. Yamada watched the American barrage from his observation post 800 yards from the Paiva River defensive line. The shells arrived with rhythmic precision that suggested mechanical process rather than human error. Each impact threw coral and vegetation into the air, the explosions creating overlapping blast zones that methodically dismantled defensive positions his troops had spent weeks constructing. Japanese doctrine taught that prepared fortifications could withstand artillery fire through depth and dispersion, but American fire volumes overwhelmed these defensive principles through sheer explosive tonnage. The bunker that had anchored Yamada's left flank, a structure built with double layers of logs and 6 feet of earth cover, disappeared under sustained bombardment that delivered over 4,000 pounds of high explosive in 15 minutes. His communications trench, connecting forward positions to command bunkers, collapsed under indirect hits that Japanese engineers had calculated would require direct strikes to cause significant damage. Most critically, the bombardment continued without pause or ammunition, concerns that might have allowed his troops to recover and rebuild damaged positions. American artillery doctrine approached fire support as scientific process controlled through mathematical calculations and radio communications, rather than observed adjustments made by officers watching shell impacts through binoculars. The 3rd Marine Division's fire direction centers operated from armored vehicles equipped with communications equipment, linking them to forward observers, aerial spotters, and regimental command posts. Officers trained in ballistics calculations plotted firing data on maps marked with surveyed positions accurate to within 10 yards, allowing for predicted fire missions that placed shells on target without preliminary ranging shots that announced impending bombardments. The system's effectiveness depended on industrial support that Japanese forces could not match even with equivalent training and doctrine. American artillery batteries received continuous resupply from ammunition dumps, stocked with shells manufactured in quantities that treated each round as an expendable resource rather than carefully conserved asset. Radio communications operated on frequencies that allowed multiple fire missions to proceed simultaneously without interference, while forward observers carried lightweight radio sets that Japanese electronics industry could not produce in comparable numbers or reliability. By the 3rd day of operations on Bougainville, Shoup's battalion had expended over 11,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition, while maintaining firing positions that showed no signs of ammunition shortage or logistical strain. The division's artillery fired over 130,000 shells during the first week of combat, delivering more explosive tonnage than the entire Imperial Japanese Army had expended during the previous month of operations across all Pacific theaters combined. Yamada's regimental artillery had fired 168 rounds during the same period, carefully rationing ammunition that Takeshi arrived through supply lines constantly disrupted by American air attacks and naval bombardments. Each shell represented a tactical asset that required careful consideration before expenditure, while American batteries fired preliminary bombardments that expended hundreds of rounds simply to ensure accurate survey data for subsequent fire missions. The disparity in artillery capabilities forced fundamental changes in Japanese defensive tactics that acknowledged American material superiority could not be overcome through traditional approaches to ground combat. Yamada received orders from division headquarters emphasizing dispersion, camouflage, and mobile defense, rather than the prepared positions that had characterized Japanese tactics during earlier campaigns. American artillery made static defenses suicidal, as any position that could be identified by aerial reconnaissance or forward observers would be subjected to bombardments that no fortification could withstand. Japanese infantry learned to occupy positions only during hours of darkness, withdrawing to concealed locations during daylight when American artillery dominated the battlefield. The effectiveness of these adaptive tactics remained limited by American artillery's ability to deliver fires across entire operational areas rather than targeting specific positions. Shoup's battalion participated in harassment and interdiction missions that targeted suspected Japanese assembly areas, supply routes, and command posts, with fires delivered according to intelligence estimates rather than observed enemy activity. These missions created zones where Japanese forces could not operate safely even when no American infantry advanced in their sectors, effectively ceding territory through firepower rather than ground maneuver. The Imperial Japanese Army's institutional response to American artillery superiority reflected industrial limitations that could not be remedied through tactical innovation or tekita, operational doctrine. Japanese artillery production focused on lightweight weapons suitable for the difficult terrain that characterized Pacific combat theaters, but this emphasis on mobility came at the cost of range and firepower that American forces exploited through heavy weapons supported by industrial logistics. The Type 94 mountain gun remained the standard Japanese regimental artillery piece throughout the Pacific War, despite its obvious inadequacy against American forces equipped with weapons capable of outranging and overwhelming Japanese batteries through sheer volume of fire. Attempts to deploy heavier artillery encountered logistical obstacles that American forces did not face due to their industrial capacity and transportation networks. The Type 92 105mm cannon possessed range and explosive power comparable to American howitzers, but weighed over 5,000 pounds and required tracked tractors for mobility across jungle terrain. Japanese industrial capacity could not produce sufficient tractors to mechanize artillery battalions, while simultaneously manufacturing the tanks, trucks, and aircraft that competing operational requirements demanded. American industry produced all of these weapon systems in quantities that treated individual losses as acceptable rather than strategic disasters. December 8, 1943. The Japanese counter-offensive at Hellzapoppin Ridge began at 0300 hours with infiltration tactics designed to avoid American artillery by closing with enemy infantry in terrain too close for supporting fires. Yamada led his company through the jungle darkness, each man carrying reduced equipment loads that prioritized ammunition and grenades over rations or medical supplies. The plan called for rapid penetration of American lines, followed by hand-to-hand combat that negated the firepower advantages that dominated daylight operations. The attack achieved initial surprise, with Japanese infantry reaching marine foxholes before defenders could organize coherent resistance. For 30 minutes, the fighting devolved into close-quarters combat, where American artillery played no role, and Japanese tactical skill showed itself through coordinated squad movements and aggressive use of grenades and bayonets. Then Morrison, Shoup's forward observer, established radio contact with the Fire Direction Center and called for illumination rounds. The first star shells burst 800 feet above the battlefield at 0335, casting harsh white light across terrain where Japanese infantry had been advancing under cover of darkness. Morrison immediately followed with calls for high explosive fires on coordinates 200 yards in front of Marine defensive positions, trusting that American infantry would take cover while artillery devastated the exposed attackers. The response came within 90 seconds as 6 howitzers fired for effect, delivering 36 rounds that landed in a rectangular pattern encompassing the Japanese assault force. Yamada's company took cover as the barrage walked across their positions with mechanical precision, each shell impact throwing steel fragments that carved through troops unable to find adequate protection in the jungle undergrowth. The illumination rounds continued firing at 30-second intervals, eliminating the darkness that Japanese tactics had relied upon to close with American forces. Within 10 minutes, the counterattack had stalled under artillery fires that continued without pause or ammunition concerns. Morrison adjusted fire as Japanese infantry attempted to withdraw, walking the impact zone back toward their assembly areas and catching troops in open terrain where they had expected darkness to provide concealment. Shoup's battalion expended over 1,000 rounds during the 3-hour engagement, sustaining fire rates that Japanese forces could not have matched, even with equivalent numbers of guns and unlimited ammunition supplies. The American artillery's ability to deliver fires in response to radio calls from forward observers, to illuminate the battlefield on demand, and to sustain high-volume fires throughout extended engagements demonstrated advantages that transcended simple gun counts or shell weights. The failed counterattack cost Yamada's regiment over 40% casualties, while achieving minimal tactical gains that American forces reversed during the following day's operations. The engagement confirmed lessons that Japanese commanders had learned throughout the Bougainville campaign regarding the futility of attacking American forces, supported by artillery that could respond within minutes to any threat and sustain fires until the threat was eliminated or withdrawn. Japanese after-action reports from Bougainville recommended avoiding offensive operations against American forces unless artillery could be neutralized through counter-battery fire or surprise attacks achieved before forward observers could call for supporting fires. These recommendations acknowledged that Japanese artillery lacked the range, ammunition supplies, and communication systems necessary to suppress American batteries that operated from positions beyond the reach of Japanese counterfires. The Type 94 mountain guns could not engage American howitzers emplaced 8 to 10,000 yards behind front lines, while Japanese forward observers lacked the radio equipment necessary to coordinate fires with the speed and precision that American fire direction centers achieved routinely. The institutional advantages that supported American artillery superiority extended beyond weapons and ammunition to encompass training systems, maintenance capabilities, and logistics networks that Japanese forces could not replicate. Shoup's gun crews had trained for months on firing ranges, where they expended thousands of practice rounds, perfecting the mechanical sequences that allowed rapid, accurate fire. Japanese artillery training, constrained by ammunition shortages and limited access to practice ranges, prepared crews through dry firing exercises and minimal live fire training that left them less proficient in the rapid-fire missions that characterized Pacific combat. American artillery maintenance sections operated with complete sets of spare parts, specialized tools, and trained technicians who could repair or replace major components in field conditions. Japanese maintenance relied on improvisation and cannibalization of damaged weapons to keep remaining guns operational, resulting in decreased readiness rates as campaigns progressed and supply lines degraded. The logistics network supporting American artillery reflected industrial capacity that treated ammunition expenditure as a production problem rather than a strategic constraint. Ammunition ships delivered shells directly to combat theaters where specialized cargo handling equipment transferred them to supply dumps maintained by dedicated logistics units. Japanese artillery ammunition moved through supply chains designed for infantry equipment, resulting in bottlenecks that left guns immobilized for lack of shells, even when overall ammunition stocks remained adequate. By January 1944, the Bougainville campaign had demonstrated patterns that would characterize artillery operations throughout the remaining Pacific War. American forces approached ground combat as coordinated application of infantry maneuver and artillery fires, with the heavy weapons providing the decisive killing power while infantry secured terrain and identified targets. Japanese forces adopted defensive tactics that acknowledged artillery superiority could not be overcome through traditional approaches, emphasizing concealment, dispersion, and avoidance of engagement under conditions where American fires could be brought to bear effectively. The 3rd Marine Division's artillery fired over 450,000 rounds during the Bougainville campaign, expending more shells in 3 months than the Imperial Japanese Army possessed in its entire Pacific Theater artillery inventory. This disparity reflected industrial production rates that had transformed artillery from supporting arm to dominant factor in determining ground combat outcomes. March 19, 1945. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima absorbed sound in ways that made the American preliminary bombardment seem muffled, despite delivering explosive tonnages that exceeded any previous amphibious operation. Major Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 9 months transforming the island into a fortress designed specifically to counter American artillery superiority through defensive depth and concealment that would survive even the most intensive bombardments. His 109th Division occupied positions that extended 3 levels deep into the volcanic rock, with interconnected tunnels allowing troops to move between firing positions without exposure to American observation or fires. The defensive system represented Japanese military engineering at its most sophisticated, attempting to create conditions where American artillery advantages would be negated through fortifications that could not be destroyed by indirect fire alone. The 5-inch naval guns of the U.S. Fifth Fleet had fired over 22,000 rounds during the 3-day preliminary bombardment, while Marine artillery battalions landed on D-Day, added their fires to a preparation that was supposed to have eliminated organized resistance before infantry advanced inland from the beaches. Kuribayashi watched through periscopes from his command bunker as American shells impacted across the island's surface. Understanding that the bombardment represented firepower his own artillery could never match, but confident that his defensive preparations would survive even this unprecedented application of explosive force. Colonel Louis Metzger commanded the 13th Marine Regiment, the 4th Marine Division's artillery component assigned to support operations on Iwo Jima's eastern beaches. His 3 battalions deployed with 75mm pack howitzers, chosen for their lighter weight and easier maneuverability in the volcanic terrain, but the decision to use lighter guns reflected tactical requirements rather than production constraints. American industry could have provided 105mm howitzers in whatever quantities the operation required. The choice of lighter weapons acknowledged that Iwo Jima's unique terrain demanded mobility over range and explosive power. The initial artillery emplacement proceeded according to plans refined through 2 years of Pacific amphibious operations. Gun crews landed with their howitzers in the second wave, dragging the pieces across volcanic sand that absorbed wheeled vehicle movement and forced reliance on tracked vehicles and human muscle to position guns for initial fire missions. Within 4 hours of landing, Metzger's battalions had established firing positions and begun supporting infantry advances toward Mount Suribachi and the island's interior defensive zones. The first indication that Iwo Jima would differ from previous campaigns came when forward observers called for fires on Japanese positions that aerial reconnaissance had identified as priority targets. The shells impacted on coordinates that should have contained bunkers and firing positions, but post-strike observation revealed no evidence of damaged fortifications or suppressed enemy fires. Kuribayashi's engineers had constructed positions that could survive direct hits from American artillery, with overhead protection consisting of multiple layers of steel, concrete, and volcanic rock that absorbed shell impacts without catastrophic structural failure. More significantly, many positions were located so deep underground that even heavy-caliber naval gun fires could not reach them through the overlaying rock and earth. The Japanese defensive system forced fundamental changes in how American artillery supported infantry operations. Traditional fire missions that relied on explosive effect to destroy enemy positions or suppress defenders proved ineffective against bunkers that could absorb multiple direct hits without significant damage. Metzger's forward observers learned to call for fires that targeted the approaches to Japanese positions rather than the positions themselves, attempting to isolate defenders and prevent reinforcement, while infantry and engineers moved forward with demolitions and flamethrowers to reduce fortifications through direct assault. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ammunition expenditure required to support these tactics exceeded anything American artillery had experienced in previous Pacific campaigns. Metzger's 3 battalions fired over 75,000 rounds during the first week of operations, expending shells at rates that required continuous ammunition ships to beach directly on Iwo Jima's shores to maintain adequate supplies. The 4th Marine Division's artillery alone consumed more ammunition during the Iwo Jima campaign than the entire Imperial Japanese Army had fired across all theaters during the previous year of combat, demonstrating industrial capacity that treated ammunition expenditure as unlimited resource rather than carefully managed asset. Kuribayashi's artillery consisted of 13 guns of various calibers positioned in caves and reinforced positions scattered across the island's interior. The largest, a Type 96 150mm howitzer, possessed range and explosive power comparable to American heavy artillery, but Japanese ammunition supplies limited the gun to fewer than 100 rounds for the entire campaign. The remaining guns, primarily Type 94 75mm mountain guns and smaller caliber pieces, fired only when targets justified the ammunition expenditure, with strict orders to preserve shells for defensive fires against American infantry assaults, rather than engaging in counter-battery duels with American artillery that possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers and ammunition. The defensive doctrine that Kuribayashi had developed acknowledged that Japanese artillery could not suppress American batteries or significantly degrade their ability to support infantry operations. Instead, Japanese guns were employed as infantry support weapons during counterattacks or to engage specific high-value targets when opportunities presented themselves. The average Japanese gun on Iwo Jima fired fewer than 20 rounds during the entire campaign, conserving ammunition for moments when its employment might achieve tactical significance rather than expending shells in futile attempts to match American fire volumes. American counter-battery operations reflected institutional advantages that extended beyond simple gun counts to encompass detection systems, fire control capabilities, and ammunition supplies that Japanese forces could not match. Marine artillery battalions operated with counter-battery radar sets that detected Japanese guns through their muzzle flashes, allowing American batteries to engage enemy artillery within minutes of their firing. Flash and sound ranging systems provided additional detection methods that created overlapping observation networks, ensuring that any Japanese gun that fired revealed its position to American counter-battery assets. The response to detected Japanese artillery came swiftly and overwhelmingly. When Kuribayashi's Type 96 howitzer fired a 6-round mission against American positions on February 24th, counter-battery radar detected the muzzle flashes and calculated the gun's position within seconds. 3 American artillery battalions received fire mission data and engaged the Japanese position with converging fires that delivered over 200 rounds within 10 minutes. The Japanese gun survived this initial counter-battery fire due to its reinforced cave position, but the experience demonstrated that any Japanese artillery employment would draw immediate response from American batteries that could sustain suppressive fires until the enemy gun was destroyed or forced to cease operations. The tactical implications of American counter-battery superiority forced Japanese artillery into increasingly passive roles as the campaign progressed. Kuribayashi's guns could fire only during periods of limited visibility or under cover of American naval bombardments that might mask their muzzle flashes from detection systems. Even these brief firing opportunities drew responses that made sustained artillery operations impossible, as American counter-battery fires saturated suspected Japanese gun positions with explosive tonnages that penetrated even reinforced fortifications through cumulative damage over multiple fire missions. By the 3rd week of fighting, Japanese artillery had been largely neutralized as a factor in the island's defense, with surviving guns immobilized by ammunition shortages, battle damage, or isolation in positions that American forces had bypassed during their advance across the island. The reduction of Mount Suribachi illustrated how American artillery employed overwhelming firepower to support infantry operations, even when Japanese defensive positions could not be destroyed through indirect fire alone. Marine artillery battalions fired over 15,000 rounds against Suribachi's slopes during the four-day assault, not expecting to collapse the mountain's extensive tunnel systems, but rather to suppress observation posts, cut communications lines, and prevent Japanese reinforcement of forward defensive positions. The fires created conditions where Marine infantry could advance with reduced casualties, while engineers and demolition teams moved forward to destroy bunkers and cave entrances through direct assault. The flag raising on February 23 occurred atop a mountain whose defenders had been isolated and depleted through artillery fires that Japanese forces lacked the capability to counter or replicate. Kuribayashi observed the American flag flying from Suribachi's peak through his command bunker periscope, understanding that the moment symbolized not just the loss of key terrain, but the complete dominance of American artillery that had made the mountain's fall inevitable, despite his troops' courage and the fortifications' strength. The northern portion of Iwo Jima contained the island's most elaborate defensive positions, including the area designated as the meat grinder by Marines who fought through 3 weeks of intense combat to reduce positions that artillery could not destroy through indirect fire. Metzger's artillery supported these operations through continuous harassment fires, illumination missions that eliminated darkness as cover for Japanese movement, and immediate response to calls from forward observers who identified targets requiring suppressive fires. The artillery fired around the clock, with gun crews working in shifts that maintained continuous fire capabilities throughout the campaign's final month. Japanese defenders in the meat grinder positions experienced the grinding effect of artillery that could not destroy their fortifications, but prevented movement, disrupted communications, and created psychological stress that degraded combat effectiveness over time. Kuribayashi's troops occupied positions that could withstand direct hits, but the continuous bombardment created conditions where defenders could not rest, could not resupply forward positions, and could not coordinate counterattacks that might have disrupted American operations. The cumulative effect of tens of thousands of artillery rounds impacting across confined terrain created an environment where Japanese forces survived but could not fight effectively, leading to slow collapse of defensive coherence as individual positions were reduced through combined arms assaults that artillery supported but could not accomplish alone. The final week of organized resistance on Iwo Jima saw American artillery shift to harassment and interdiction missions designed to prevent Japanese forces from conducting coordinated withdrawals or consolidating defensive positions in the island's northern caves. Metzger's battalions fired pre-planned missions throughout each night, delivering shells on coordinates where intelligence estimated Japanese troops might move or assemble. These fires achieved little measurable destruction of enemy forces, but created conditions where Japanese movement became hazardous, and coordination between isolated units impossible, accelerating the defensive collapse that culminated in Kuribayashi's death during a final counterattack on March 26. The Iwo Jima campaign demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of American artillery superiority against defensive systems specifically designed to survive indirect fire. Marine artillery had fired over 450,000 rounds during the 36-day campaign, expending more shells than the entire Imperial Japanese Army possessed in its combined Pacific Theater inventory. This overwhelming application of firepower had supported infantry operations and created conditions favorable to American tactical success, but had not achieved the decisive destruction of enemy forces that artillery had accomplished in previous campaigns, where Japanese defenses lacked Iwo Jima's depth and engineering sophistication. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima would influence American artillery employment during the Okinawa campaign, where Japanese forces again relied on defensive depth and fortification to survive preliminary bombardments and force American infantry into prolonged attritional combat. The artillery superiority that American forces maintained throughout these operations remained a significant factor in determining tactical outcomes, but the campaigns demonstrated that even overwhelming firepower advantages could be partially negated by defensive preparations that acknowledged those advantages and designed fortifications to survive rather than prevent American artillery's devastating effects. April 1, 1945. The preliminary bombardment of Okinawa represented the largest application of American artillery and naval gunfire in Pacific War history, with over 40,000 shells delivered against beach defenses during the week preceding the landing. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had studied the lessons of previous campaigns and designed his defensive strategy specifically to waste this massive expenditure of American firepower on largely empty beaches and forward positions. His 32nd Army occupied fortified lines in Okinawa's southern mountains, positions located beyond the range of American artillery that would land with assault forces and protected by terrain that would force attacking infantry into killing zones, where Japanese advantages in defensive positioning might offset American material superiority. Major General Pedro del Valle commanded the 10th Army's artillery, a force that included not just Marine and Army divisional artillery, but corps-level battalions equipped with 155mm guns, capable of ranging deep into Okinawa's interior. His command represented the largest concentration of American artillery employed in any Pacific operation, with over 650 tubes available to support ground operations once positions could be established ashore. The firepower available exceeded that of entire armies during previous conflicts, reflecting industrial production that had transformed artillery from supporting arm to dominant factor in ground combat. The initial landing on April 1st proceeded with surprising ease, as American forces encountered minimal resistance on beaches that Ushijima had deliberately left lightly defended. This tactical decision forced American artillery to expend tens of thousands of shells against positions that contained few defenders, conserving Japanese combat power for the defensive battle that would develop once American forces advanced south toward the fortified zone around Shuri Castle. Del Valle's artillery battalions established firing positions and began supporting the advance with harassment fires and pre-planned missions against suspected Japanese positions, but the effectiveness of these fires remained limited by lack of identified targets and Japanese defensive tactics that avoided exposure to American observation. The first major engagement came when American infantry reached the outer defensive line of Ushijima's fortified zone on April 8. The Kakazu Ridge position had been surveyed and pre-registered by Japanese artillery observers during months of preparation, allowing defensive fires to be called with accuracy that American forces had not previously encountered from Japanese gunners. The Type 96 150mm howitzers that Ushijima had carefully conserved opened fire from concealed positions, delivering shells that landed among American infantry with precision that suggested sophisticated fire control systems and adequate ammunition supplies. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces encountered Japanese artillery employed with doctrine and capabilities that approached their own standards, though still limited by overall numbers and ammunition constraints that prevented sustained fire missions. Del Valle's counter-battery response demonstrated the overwhelming superiority that American artillery maintained even against improved Japanese capabilities. Counter-battery radars detected the Japanese guns within seconds of their firing, while aerial observers and ground-based observation posts triangulated positions from muzzle flashes and sound signatures. Within minutes, 3 American artillery battalions engaged the Japanese positions with converging fires that delivered over 600 rounds in the first 15 minutes. The bombardment forced Japanese guns to cease firing and withdraw deeper into cave positions, demonstrating that improved Japanese artillery doctrine could not overcome the fundamental disparity in numbers and ammunition that favored American forces by ratios exceeding 10-1. Ushijima's artillery, the most capable Japanese force American commanders had yet encountered in the Pacific, numbered approximately 150 guns of various calibers positioned throughout the Shuri defensive zone. This represented a significant concentration by Japanese standards, equivalent to the artillery organic to 3 Imperial Army divisions consolidated under unified command. The force included Type 96 155mm howitzers, Type 92, 105mm cannons, and numerous Type 94 75mm mountain guns positioned in mutually supporting positions that could bring converging fires against American advances. Del Valle commanded over 650 artillery pieces, including Marine and Army divisional batteries, plus corps-level battalions, equipped with 155mm guns and 8-inch howitzers, capable of delivering 200-pound shells to ranges exceeding 18,000 yards. The numerical superiority approached 4-to-1 in tube count, but the actual firepower disparity exceeded 10-to-1 when ammunition supplies and sustained fire capabilities were factored into the equation. American artillery could fire continuously for hours, while Japanese guns fired brief missions before withdrawing to conserve ammunition and avoid counter-battery fires that would destroy any position revealed through sustained operations. The battle for Kakazu Ridge on April 9th demonstrated how American artillery transformed infantry assaults through preparatory fires that Japanese defenses could survive but not effectively counter. Del Valle's battalions fired over 20,000 rounds during the day-long engagement, delivering shells in coordinated programs that suppressed Japanese positions, destroyed communication lines, and isolated forward defenders from reinforcement. The 27th Infantry Division's attack failed to capture the ridge due to the strength of Japanese fortifications and determined defensive resistance, but the artillery support prevented Japanese counterattacks that might have inflicted even heavier casualties on the stalled American forces. Japanese artillery fired approximately 800 rounds during the same engagement, carefully rationed missions that targeted American assembly areas and command posts when opportunities presented themselves. Ushijima's gunners achieved several direct hits on American positions, but the overall effect remained minimal compared to the devastation that American fires inflicted on Japanese defensive works. Each Japanese shell represented a carefully conserved asset that required approval from senior commanders before expenditure, while American batteries fired preliminary bombardments that expended hundreds of rounds simply to ensure accurate targeting data for subsequent missions. The attritional nature of Okinawa's ground campaign favored American forces, whose artillery could sustain continuous operations, while Japanese guns gradually depleted their ammunition and suffered cumulative damage from ATC, counter-battery fires. By the end of April, Ushijima's artillery had been reduced to fewer than 100 operational guns through a combination of battle damage, ammunition shortages, and loss of forward observation capabilities that degraded fire control effectiveness. American artillery, meanwhile, maintained full operational strength through continuous resupply and replacement of battle-damaged equipment, with some battalions receiving entirely new gun tubes to replace weapons worn out by the intensive firing rates sustained throughout the campaign. The May offensive against the Shuri Line demonstrated American artillery's ability to support coordinated multi-division assaults through fires that exceeded anything Japanese forces had experienced in previous campaigns. Del Valle's fire plan called for preliminary bombardments that would deliver over 190,000 rounds during the 72 hours preceding the main attack, a volume of fire that exceeded the total artillery ammunition expenditure of the Imperial Japanese Army during the previous year of operations across all Pacific theaters. The bombardment began at 500 hours on May 11th, with counter-battery fires designed to suppress Japanese artillery and prevent interference with American infantry operations. Every identified Japanese gun position received concentrated fires from multiple American battalions, with some priority targets assigned fire missions that delivered over 1,000 rounds on areas measuring just 200 yards square. The Japanese artillery that had performed credibly during earlier phases of the campaign found itself overwhelmed by fires that continued for hours without pause, forcing gun crews to abandon their positions or remain in protective shelters, while American shells systematically destroyed communication lines, ammunition, stocks, and observation posts that Japanese fire control systems required for effective operations. The main bombardment shifted to Japanese defensive positions at 0700 hours, delivering shells in carefully calculated patterns that suppressed infantry positions, destroyed bunkers, and created lanes through minefields and wire obstacles. Forward observers accompanied assault infantry, calling for adjustments that walked fires ahead of advancing troops and engaged targets that revealed themselves through defensive fires. The coordination between infantry and artillery reflected doctrine refined through 3 years of Pacific combat, creating integrated combined arms operations where heavy weapons provided the decisive killing power while infantry secured terrain and exploited openings created by preparatory fires. Ushijima watched the bombardment from his command bunker deep beneath Shuri Castle, understanding that his defensive system was being dismantled through application of firepower that Japanese forces could neither match nor effectively counter. His artillery had been reduced to fewer than 60 operational guns, most unable to fire due to ammunition shortages or damage that prevented sustained operations. The communication systems that allowed coordinated defensive fires had been degraded by counter-battery fires that severed telephone lines and destroyed radio equipment faster than repair teams could restore capabilities. Most critically, forward observation posts had been eliminated through systematic American fires that targeted any position from which Japanese observers might direct artillery, forcing remaining guns to fire on pre-planned coordinates without adjustment for American movements or tactical changes. The week-long battle that followed the May 11th bombardment consumed American artillery ammunition at rates exceeding 50,000 rounds per day, with some individual battalions firing over 4,000 shells in 24-hour periods. These firing rates represented sustainable operations for American artillery, supported by logistics networks that treated ammunition expenditure as unlimited resource rather than carefully managed constraint. Ships delivered shells directly to Okinawa's beaches, where specialized cargo handling units transferred them to trucks that maintained continuous supply flows to forward artillery positions. The system operated 24 hours per day throughout the campaign, ensuring that ammunition shortages never limited American artillery's ability to respond to fire missions or support infantry operations. Japanese ammunition supplies, meanwhile, declined to critically low levels as American naval forces interdicted the few remaining supply lines connecting Okinawa to the home islands. Ushijima's artillery fired fewer than 5,000 rounds during the week of intensive combat following the May 11th offensive, carefully rationing shells for defensive fires, directly supporting infantry positions under attack. By mid-May, some Japanese batteries had been reduced to fewer than 10 rounds per gun, insufficient ammunition to support sustained defensive operations or conduct counter-battery fires against American artillery that continued firing without apparent ammunition concerns. The fall of Shuri Castle on May 27th symbolized the collapse of Japanese defensive coherence under sustained artillery pressure that Japanese forces could not survive or effectively resist. Ushijima ordered withdrawal to final defensive positions on Okinawa's southern peninsula, a movement conducted under continuous American artillery fires that inflicted heavy casualties on troops attempting to disengage and reposition. Del Valle's battalions fired harassment and interdiction missions throughout each night of the withdrawal period, delivering shells on routes and areas where intelligence estimated Japanese forces might move. These fires achieved significant destruction of withdrawing units, while demonstrating American artillery's ability to dominate the battlefield, even when Japanese forces attempted to avoid direct engagement. Final defensive line around Kunishi Ridge and Hill 89 contained what remained of Ushijima's artillery, fewer than 40 operational guns with ammunition supplies adequate for only brief defensive fires. American artillery supporting the assault on these positions numbered over 600 tubes, with ammunition stocks sufficient to sustain maximum firing rates for weeks if necessary. The disparity had reached levels where tactical comparisons became meaningless, as Japanese artillery existed as vestigial force, incapable of affecting battle outcomes, while American batteries dominated every aspect of ground combat through fires that Japanese forces could neither suppress nor survive. The final assault began June 10th, with preparatory fires that delivered over 80,000 rounds during the initial 48 hours. Japanese positions that had survived months of bombardment finally collapsed under sustained fires that continued until forward. Observers confirmed destruction, or American infantry, had overrun the targets. Ushijima's remaining artillery fired its final missions on June 18, expending the last ammunition in brief defensive fires that achieved minimal effect against American forces, supported by artillery that continued operating at full capability throughout the engagement. By June 21, organized Japanese resistance had ceased, with Ushijima conducting ritual suicide rather than surrender to forces whose material superiority had proven impossible to overcome through defensive tactics or tactical innovation. The statistical accounting of artillery expenditures on Okinawa revealed the extent of American firepower superiority that had characterized the campaign. Del Valle's artillery had fired over 2,650,000 rounds during the 82-day battle, averaging over 32,000 shells per day throughout the operation. This volume exceeded the total artillery ammunition that the Imperial Japanese Army possessed in its entire Pacific Theater inventory at the war's beginning, demonstrating industrial production capabilities that treated each shell as expendable resource rather than carefully conserved asset. Japanese artillery on Okinawa fired approximately 65,000 rounds during the same period, a respectable total by Japanese standards but representing less than 3% of American ammunition expenditure. The human cost of this firepower disparity manifested in casualty figures that showed how artillery dominated ground combat outcomes. American forces suffered over 48,000 battle casualties during the Okinawa campaign, but Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000, killed with estimates suggesting artillery fires caused over 60% of enemy losses. The ratio demonstrated that American artillery achieved its primary purpose of destroying enemy forces while minimizing friendly casualties through application of overwhelming firepower that reduced the need for infantry to close with and destroy enemies through direct assault. Japanese survivors captured during the campaign's final weeks provided testimony regarding artillery's psychological effects that complemented the physical destruction documented in casualty reports. Soldiers described the continuous bombardment as producing mental strain that degraded combat effectiveness, independent of actual physical casualties. The inability to rest, the constant threat of random shell impacts, and the knowledge that Japanese artillery could not provide comparable counterfires created psychological conditions that many survivors rated as more debilitating than food shortages or medical supply limitations. American prisoners captured by Japanese forces early in the war had reported similar psychological effects from Japanese artillery, but the intensity and duration of American bombardments exceeded anything Japanese forces had inflicted by orders of magnitude, that created qualitatively different combat experiences. The Okinawa campaign marked the final major ground combat operation of the Pacific War, demonstrating artillery effectiveness that would influence American planning for the proposed invasion of Japan's home islands. Del Valle's after-action reports emphasized artillery's central role in achieving tactical success against determined defenders occupying favorable terrain, recommending even larger artillery allocations for future operations where Japanese forces might replicate Okinawa's defensive depth and fortification quality. The planning documents for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, called for artillery support exceeding even Okinawa's massive allocations, with some divisions assigned artillery ratios approaching 1 gun for every 100 infantrymen, representing firepower densities unprecedented in military history. August 6, 1945. The atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima represented a different application of American industrial and scientific capacity, but the decision to employ atomic weapons reflected partly the costs that conventional operations like Okinawa had demonstrated. Artillery superiority had proven decisive in defeating Japanese forces, but the campaigns required months of sustained combat and casualty rates that American political leadership found increasingly difficult to justify. The atomic bombs offered a means to achieve strategic victory without the prolonged ground campaigns that even overwhelming artillery support could not abbreviate below unacceptable timelines. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15th acknowledged Japan's inability to continue resistance against enemies whose material advantages had proven insurmountable through tactical innovation or defensive preparation. The Imperial Japanese Army possessed fewer than 2,000 operational artillery pieces at war's end, many immobilized by ammunition shortages and maintenance issues that Japanese industrial collapse had made irreparable. American artillery in the Pacific Theater numbered over 12,000 tubes, with ammunition supplies adequate to sustain maximum firing rates for extended periods, representing firepower superiority that exceeded 20-to-1 in deployable assets and approached 100-to-1 when ammunition, availability, and sustainability were considered. The broader strategic lessons of artillery operations in the Pacific War extended beyond simple comparisons of gun counts or ammunition expenditures to fundamental questions about industrial capacity's role in modern warfare. Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spirit, tactical skill, and acceptance of material limitations as necessary components of warrior culture. This approach achieved impressive tactical successes during the war's early phases, when Japanese forces fought opponents with limited material advantages or inadequate doctrine for employing their superior resources effectively. Against American forces that combined tactical competence with overwhelming material superiority, supported by industrial production, treating warfare as engineering problem to be solved through superior resources, Japanese tactical excellence proved insufficient to achieve strategic success or even prevent catastrophic defeat. American artillery doctrine reflected institutional understanding that firepower advantages required systematic support to achieve tactical significance. The guns themselves represented just one component of integrated systems that included fire control equipment, communications networks, forward observer training, and logistics infrastructures, treating ammunition as unlimited resource rather than carefully managed constraint. Japanese forces possessed individual artillery pieces comparable in capability to American weapons, but lacked the institutional support systems that transformed American artillery from collection of individual guns into coordinated fire support network capable of dominating battlefields through sustained application of overwhelming firepower. The 12-to-1 superiority that shocked Japanese forces on Bougainville had grown to 20-to-1 by Okinawa as American production accelerated, while Japanese manufacturing collapsed under sustained strategic bombing and resource shortages. This progression demonstrated that industrial capacity advantages compounded over time, with nations possessing superior production capabilities growing relatively stronger as campaigns progressed, while opponents with limited industrial bases found their material disadvantages increasing even when tactical performance remained constant. Colonel Shoup sat in his quarters at Camp Pendleton in November 1945, reading after-action reports from artillery operations throughout the Pacific War. The statistics painted a picture of firepower dominance so complete that future military historians might question whether the numbers represented actual expenditures or typographical errors. American artillery had fired over 16 million rounds during Pacific campaigns, delivering explosive tonnages that exceeded all artillery ammunition expended by all combatants during World War I. Japanese artillery had fired approximately 1.2 million rounds during the same period, respectable total by absolute standards, but representing less than 8% of American expenditure. The 3rd Marine Division's artillery, the unit Shoup had served with on Bougainville, had fired more shells during that single campaign than the entire Imperial Japanese Army possessed in its Pacific Theater inventory at the war's beginning. This comparison illustrated not just firepower superiority but fundamental differences in how American and Japanese militaries approached the material requirements of modern warfare. American planning treated ammunition expenditure as production problem to be solved through industrial capacity, while Japanese doctrine emphasized conservation and acceptance of material limitations as necessary constraints on tactical operations. Shoup reflected on conversations with Japanese prisoners during the war's final months, particularly artillery officers who had trained on American equipment during pre-war exchanges and understood the technical similarities between opposing weapons. These officers acknowledged that individual Japanese guns possessed capabilities comparable to American pieces, but emphasized that Japanese artillery lacked the ammunition supplies, communications equipment, and logistics support that allowed American batteries to sustain fires for hours or days without degradation in capability. One captured major had observed that Japanese and American artillery differed less in their weapons than in their nation's willingness to expend resources on scales that Japanese industrial capacity could not sustain. The human dimension of artillery superiority manifested in survival rates that showed how firepower shaped combat outcomes beyond simple casualty counts. American artillery casualties remained relatively low throughout Pacific campaigns, with gun crews typically operating from positions beyond the range of Japanese counterfires and protected by infantry screens that prevented close assault on battery positions. Japanese artillery suffered devastating losses as counter-battery fires systematically eliminated guns revealed through their firing, creating survival rates so poor that some Japanese artillery units lost over 70% of their personnel during extended campaigns. The psychological impact on Japanese infantry proved equally significant, as soldiers learned they could expect no effective artillery support during defensive operations, while American forces operated with fire support that responded within minutes to forward observer calls. This disparity in artillery availability affected morale and tactical confidence in ways that casualty statistics alone could not capture, creating combat environments where Japanese forces understood they fought at fundamental disadvantage that courage and tactical skill could mitigate, but not overcome. The final accounting of Pacific War artillery operations revealed patterns that would influence military doctrine for generations. American forces had demonstrated that overwhelming firepower superiority, when supported by adequate logistics and doctrine exploiting material advantages, could achieve decisive results against determined opponents occupying favorable terrain. The effectiveness of this approach depended critically on industrial capacity producing ammunition at rates treating each shell as expendable resource, a condition that only nations with highly developed manufacturing infrastructure could sustain during prolonged conflicts. Japanese forces had proven that tactical innovation and defensive preparation could partially offset firepower disparities, with fortifications on Iwo Jima and Okinawa surviving bombardments that would have obliterated less sophisticated defensive systems. These successes remained limited by inability to prevent American artillery from isolating defensive positions, suppressing communications, and creating conditions where Japanese forces could survive but not fight effectively. The campaigns demonstrated that even the most sophisticated fortifications could not fully negate artillery advantages, approaching 10-1 in deployable firepower and 100-1 in sustainable ammunition expenditure. The institutional lessons extended beyond tactics and technology to fundamental questions about military culture and its relationship to industrial capacity. Japanese emphasis on spiritual discipline and acceptance of material limitations had created military forces capable of extraordinary tactical achievements when fighting opponents with comparable or only modest material advantages. Against enemies combining tactical competence with overwhelming industrial superiority, this cultural approach produced forces that fought with impressive determination but could not overcome resource disparities so large that tactical excellence became irrelevant to strategic outcomes. American military culture approached warfare as an engineering problem, requiring adequate resources and systematic application of superior materiel to achieve victory with minimum friendly casualties. This philosophy demanded industrial capacity, producing equipment and ammunition at rates that Japanese manufacturing could not match, but when that capacity existed, it created military forces capable of sustaining operations indefinitely, while enemies with limited industrial bases found their capabilities degrading through attrition they could not replace or replenish. The 12-1 artillery superiority that had shocked Japanese forces on Bougainville represented not aberration or temporary advantage, but systematic application of American industrial capacity to military requirements. The superiority had increased rather than decreased as the war progressed, demonstrating that industrial advantages compounded over time as nations with superior production capabilities could sustain and increase their material edge, while opponents with limited manufacturing found their relative disadvantages, growing even when their absolute capabilities remained constant. Shoup's final reflection noted that future conflicts might not replicate the specific conditions that had made American artillery superiority so decisive in Pacific campaigns. Different terrain, different tactical situations, or different strategic objectives might reduce artillery's relative importance compared to other combat arms. However, the fundamental lesson remained valid across varying circumstances. Industrial capacity to produce and sustain material superiority represented decisive advantage in modern warfare when combined with tactical competence and doctrine designed to exploit resource advantages. Nations lacking industrial infrastructure supporting sustained high-intensity operations would find themselves at fundamental disadvantage against opponents whose manufacturing capabilities treated ammunition expenditure, equipment losses, and logistics requirements as problems to be solved through production rather than constraints to be accepted through spiritual discipline. The 12-to-1 artillery superiority had not determined Pacific War outcomes by itself, but had represented one component of systematic American material advantages, spanning every aspect of military operations, from individual soldier equipment to strategic logistics networks. Japanese forces had learned through bitter experience that tactical excellence and defensive innovation could delay but not prevent defeat when fighting opponents whose industrial capacity produced forces growing stronger as campaigns progressed while Japanese capabilities diminished through attrition that could not be replaced. The lessons would influence military planning for generations, establishing firepower superiority, supported by adequate industrial capacity as fundamental requirement for military forces, expecting to prevail in sustained high-intensity conflicts against capable, determined opponents. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.